Hello, I'm Patricia Harpring, Managing Editor of the Getty Vocabulary Program. I'm going to share my screen with you now. There we go. I want to give you an update on some issues surrounding unbiased terminology and personal privacy that we're working on and that may interest you too. There we go. So first I'm going to give you a little bit of context and then dive right into the issues. The Union List of Artist Names, or ULAN, is contributed to VIAF. It's one of the Getty Vocabularies produced at the Getty Research Institute, which, by the way, is also known for having one of the most extensive collections, library collections, on the topic of art history in the world. And we are not directly affiliated with the library, although we're very close colleagues and work together. But ULAN is a bit different in scope and context than other data sets in VIAF. So today I want to give you an update on issues of concern to the visual arts, but also to the library and archives communities. In the global environment where we strive to be more open and equitable while maintaining high standards for scholarship and research, the Getty Vocabularies intend to provide appropriate terms for art history and also related disciplines. And I'm going to talk about just a selection of the issues surrounding this topic and let you know that we don't have all the answers, and successful resolutions will, in this rapidly changing world, will be ongoing, certainly over months and even years. And we'll work in concert with our user communities and contributors. So the target audience, we want to provide terminology and rich data to catalog, document, retrieve, discover art information for museums, special collections, visual resources collections, archives and libraries, scholarly projects and scholars. The Getty Vocabularies are rich knowledge bases. They are not simple value vocabularies or authorities, but intended for research and discovery. They are authoritative. We cite our authoritative sources and contributors, but they're not what we call authoritarian. So they do differ in their use from bibliographic cataloging by many of our users, at least. They can use any of the variant terms. They don't need to use only the preferred term or heading. And it was by this, in this way, that we were able to get buy-in from our large community. The Getty Vocabularies comply with standards for controlled vocabularies, ISO and NISO standards. They were begun in the 1980s. So we compile the terminology from contributions from expert contributors, usually institutions. The data are vetted, normalized, and then merged, which is like clustering, and processed. And we publish them monthly in an online search in APIs, relational tables, linked open data, under the Open Data Commons attribution license. For some of our users, the vocabularies are indeed used to promote consistency and assignment of terms, as in bibliographic cataloging, but for others, they just look at them to provide options for terms to refer to a given concept. For other users, on the other end of the process, they're using the Getty Vocabularies in retrieval and discovery to utilize the variant terms and broader, narrower contexts and rich other contextual data for research. And for yet others, these are just lookup resources for the information they contain. There are 5 Getty Vocabularies. The AAT, or Art and Architecture Thesaurus, includes generic terms in several languages for concepts such as work types and roles materials. So you'd find amphora, literati, painters, etc. there. The TGN, or Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names, includes place names for current places, but we're focusing in development on historical information for current cities, historical nations, lost settlements, etc. And it's not comprehensive for all the places in the world, but just the places needed for cataloging art. Also, TGN is not a geographic information system, it's a thesaurus, but may include co-references to GIS. So here you'd find terms such as the Ottoman Empire or the pre-Columbian site Machu Picchu. IA, the Getty Iconography Authority, includes proper names of thesaural relationships for iconographical narratives and religious or fictional characters. And here you'd find terms such as Shibaba, the Maya underworld, or Shiva, the Hindu god. CONA, the Cultural Objects Name Authority, includes titles, artist attribution, and other information for works of art and architecture, with a focus right now on architecture, lost works, and some other interesting topics. So here you would find terms for buildings such as Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, or the Flatiron Building in New York, etc. And ULAN. This is the vocabulary that we contribute to VIAF. The Union List of Artist Names includes names and biographical information for artists and architects, but also for firms and studios, repositories of art, patrons, etc. And it includes people with names such as the painter Mark Rothko, those who are anonymous masters, such as the Crevelet Master, architectural firms such as IM Pei and Partners, and even terms to provide attribution for works where we don't know who the person is by name or even appellation, but unknown Aztec would be an example of that. And here is a full record for ULAN. On the left-hand side, you see the arrows pointing to some numbers. Well, that number at the top is the unique identifier for this concept, hokusai, a Japanese printmaker. And then there are various names for hokusai, and those names also have unique identifiers, so that users can link to whichever name, excuse me, they wish to. Also, there may be dates and other information associated with these names. In the middle, you start to see the biography, the dates and nationalities, roles, and then over on the right-hand column, you see relationships to students and teachers, etc. I want to point out down at the bottom, you see we always list the contributors, basically contributing institutions who provided information for this record, as well as sources. And here we also have co-references to other resources that might have information about the same person. So we have the Library of Congress ID there, as well as the VIAF ID, etc. In the middle of the page, you see red arrows pointing to those little boxes, AAT and TGN, and that indicates that these vocabularies are linked to each other. So for the term printmaker or calligrapher for hokusai, ULAN is linking to AAT. For Tokyo, where he was born and died, it's linking to TGN, and in fact is these rich relationships, including hierarchical relationships and all of these other relationships and contextual data that makes these vocabularies so valuable for research and discovery. Now let's look at some of the issues. So we want to make the vocabularies more multilingual, multicultural, diverse, inclusive. We want to look to equity, unbiased and anti-racist terminology. We want them to be accessible. But first we have to gauge where are we now. So for example, in the pie chart on the left, we're looking at the languages in the AAT, and the biggest wedge represents English. Well, we want this to be multilingual, so we need to improve this and get more contributions in other languages. In the pie chart on the right, this is from ULAN, the cultures and nationalities. That biggest wedge represents European artists. So here also, we have a lot of work to do to make this more multicultural than it already is. And the reason it is Western-centric to a large extent now is because of the historical content of the vocabularies having come from institutions that collected Western art. We also want to look at who is using the vocabularies. Now these graphs represent usage of the Getty vocabularies in a given month, any given month at the Getty. And you see the little dots on the map. All over the world they're used, but the biggest chunk of users are coming from the United States. Half of that chart come from the US. So we're trying to improve that as well. Now, to learn how to improve the vocabularies, we look at the work being done by other groups. There are a number of committees and statements and groups working at the Getty, and certainly we work with them and consult with them. We look also to related disciplines, the library community, visual resources community, archival community, museums, universities, government agencies, and published scholarship in art history, archaeology, anthropology, and history. We always tell our users to remember that the Getty Vocabularies provide terminology in use by the community. They do not prescribe how to use the terms beyond some scope note suggestions sometimes. That is, the vocabularies do not prescribe, but instead assist in decision-making by providing contextual information. We have rich preferences throughout the vocabularies to inform users, for example, for a given record, which is the term most commonly used in authoritative scholarly publications in English. So that's flagged preferred. We also have a preferred term for each language, a preferred term for each contributor, and a preferred term for each source, so the users can judge from this which term do they wish to use. We also have additional flags that further classify the terms. For example, noting a pejorative or objectionable term that is labeled avoid use. We might have terms that are preferred by a particular culture noted. Now, the Getty Vocabulary Program, with our tiny department, we lack the expertise and resources to advise which is the correct term to use in terms of being multicultural and diverse for all the millions of terms in our vocabularies. So instead, we hope to actuate change and keep up with the times by using preferred terms and increased diversity provided by our user community who contribute to the Getty Vocabularies. Now, here's an example of one of the issues. We want to facilitate the use of unbiased terminology. So this is a term, illegal aliens was formerly the preferred term. It's now flagged as pejorative, and the preferred term is undocumented immigrants. Now, we do look to Library of Congress, of course, to see what they're doing, and they have deprecated illegal aliens to the 450 field, and they prefer as the heading non-citizens. But this does point out how our practice and library practice might differ. In Library of Congress, you note not all of these 450 fields are actually true synonyms for illegal aliens. They have expatriates there, non-citizens, foreign residents. But in the AAT, we have a different goal. The purpose of library cataloging is to group together headings that may be used to index similar topics in books or whatever. But for AAT, we're grouping synonyms for disambiguation and precision in indexing and research to allow scholarly discovery. We still include those other terms, though, that we saw in those 450 fields, perhaps in other records in the AAT, non-citizens and expatriates, and we would link them back to the other AAT term, formerly illegal aliens. We want to respect diverse points of view. That's another issue. So how do we do that? Well, here for the term Native American, in the note, the scope note, it advises whenever possible, use a specific tribal name. But if you have to use a general term, Native American is widely used in the United States, but many groups now prefer American Indian or Indigenous American. For Indigenous peoples of Canada, use First Nations, etc. And then we provide all of these terms and the user can decide which one they want to use. And this is another type of thing where use can change frequently over time and it's not always agreed upon. So this is a big issue. Here's another example where we try to respect cultural preferences. The term Anasazi was used for many decades to describe the culture and style of this pre-Columbian Southwestern North American culture. But now the term ancestral Puebloan is preferred by the descendants of these people. And also that preference coincides with the preponderance of modern scholarly usage. So now that is the term preferred by in the AAT. Here's another example, respecting cultural preferences. We don't force terms from other cultures into existing AAT records, or we don't insist that there's an English language term. Instead, sometimes there might be a loan term, as in this example, it's a Nahuatl term that's referring to this type of insignia shield that is used in English and in Spanish and probably other languages as the preferred term. There is a literal translation in English there that is included, but it's not a preferred, marked preferred in this record. Here's another example respecting cultural preferences. You might imagine in the iconography authority where you might have themes and deities included. We want to be very respectful when we describe and classify these topics. We want to involve scholarly experts and members of the community referenced if possible. Here's an example of a Nahuatl deity. We try to provide terminology in the AAT also to allow users to index gender identity and various preferences as necessary. And here's an area of the AAT which has grown over the last few years: gender identity. Gender non-binary is the example noted here. We want to be sensitive to biased historical points of view. And here's an example from TGN, where a place formerly was called Squaw Creek Spring. And this squaw is a term that refers to a Native American female. It's derogatory, it's pejorative. So that has been deprecated, and the term Alder Spring is now preferred. And this is also aligns with use in official government resources of the United States. Here's another example of how we can use the polyhierarchy of the TGN or any of the vocabularies to try to show, in this case, perhaps a different historical point of view, overlapping jurisdictions. So here we have a place underlined. It's called Blue Gap, and it's part of the Navajo Nation, tribal nation in the United States. But also it's in the state of Arizona. So administratively in the state of Arizona in the US, but it's also linked to the Navajo Nation. We have a polyhierarchy. I'm talking about architecture, the same thing. We need to be sensitive to biased historical points of view. Here we have Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It was first a church, then a mosque, then a museum, and now it's again a mosque. Well, which term should be preferred for this building? We are looking at the term used most often in scholarly literature, and that is Hagia Sophia, sort of an adaptation of the Greek or perhaps Turkish name. And so that's the name preferred here, but is that the proper thing to do? We think so. That's what we're doing now. We want to acknowledge various cultural traditions and respect various names and naming traditions, for example. So here, back to Hokusai's record, we have Sori as one of his names. It's an art name. It's a name he used in his career when he was working in a particular place, for example, and it's flagged as an art name. But we have other flags that we can use as well. For example, you could flag an artist as the artist's adult name for the name that's conferred at adulthood, as happens in some cultures. A person could be transgender and change their name, and the name could be flagged as a changed name. Still on Hokusai's record, this brings up the issue of respecting personal privacy that needs to be balanced with the critical ability to do research. So here for Hokusai, we have he's an 18th century artist. He was male. We have where he was born and died. We have where he was adopted. Now, is it appropriate to include this type of personal information? Here we're moving to a more recent person. So this becomes even more critical to know when it's appropriate for recent or living people. So privacy is paramount, but on the other hand, to eliminate knowledge is to deny research. People want to research female artists. Scholars want to research African-American artists. And in fact, an artist's oeuvre may be influenced by or publicly focused on their own gender identity or sexual preference. So if we exclude this data, then it is impossible to do this research. So right now, this is an open issue, but our current policy is if we are sure that the person so self-identifies and it's in reliable sources or from themselves, we include it. So here for this example, the person is transgender. Their birth name was Anna, then they changed it to Anton, and that's included there. But this is different from Library of Congress. They recently had a committee, the recommendation for personal name authorities to exclude the gender element in the records, or if they're editing a record anyway, to delete this information, because their primary goal is to of this authority data is for disambiguation in choosing which entity to link to. It's not for the contextual biographical information. So here our purposes differ. The Getty vocabularies include this rich contextual information to allow research and discovery. So then the final issue, accessibility and inclusivity. So that includes, for example, for us, the web design needs to be usable by people with disabilities, physical and cognitive. If we had a physical space, that would also apply there. But we think that this also applies to various other slices of our audiences. So regardless of their money or advanced technology or technical expertise, we want to make sure that our vocabularies remain accessible to our users. Regardless of culture and language differences, they should be accessible, and regardless of intention. So whether they use them for scholarly research, or if it's a casually interested user, or for technical developers, these are very different audiences that we feel require different releases and different types of access to the data. So looking to the future, we need to reimagine how to make the vocabularies ever more multilingual and diverse, etc. So we're working on that. And we are also trying to improve the interconnectivity of the Getty vocabularies. So there in the center, you see the little square where the vocabularies are linked to each other, and also linking out to other resources. And we hope to do more and more of that going forward. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.